for nonprofit organizations. My name is Lynn Gidluck, and I have the great privilege of leading the Community Engagement and Research Center at the University of Regina. I think we might have one of our board of directors here with us today, Elena Harrison with Inclusion Saskatchewan. Thank you, Elena, for joining us and all the work that you do for our board. I'm so happy all of you were able to join us today for our last workshop in our fall 2021 Toolkit workshop series. These workshops are brought to you by the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation and the University of Regina's Community Engagement and Research Center. And we're in the process of planning our programming for 2022. So we really want to ensure that everything we offer is valuable to community, not just training that we think you might be interested in. We're also looking at various different options for delivering our workshops, including going back to in-person sessions at the Mama Waitin Center in Regina, continuing to go online, and possibly looking at a hybrid option. So in a few moments, I'm going to share a quick survey link in the chat box, and we would really appreciate if you would take just a couple of minutes to provide us with your ideas for the types of workshops that content you'd like, and also that kind of format. Now, I'd like to apologize just briefly because we had to change the time for today's workshop. Originally, we had scheduled the session to be in the morning, but our wonderful presenter had an unanticipated conflict, and so we really appreciate your understanding for the need to change that. Now, some of you I know have attended the last couple of workshops, but so you've already kind of seen the degree of Millie's professionalism and experience, but she's got 16 years of experience in a variety of roles. And over the years, she's touched on, I think, almost all areas of human resources, fields. But today she's going to take us through what a lot of us might think is the more ugly and anxiety creating world of HR, that performance management piece. But before I hand things over to the wonderful Millie Sywanyk, I'd like to just quickly acknowledge how grateful I am to live and work in Treaty 4 territory, in the traditional territory of the Nehiyawak, Anishinaabeg, Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota First Nations, and the homeland of the Métis. We recognize Treaty 4, which was signed in this territory, and acknowledge the harms and the mistakes of the past as we kind of try to work for a better future through the work that we do with communities. So I'm going to pass everything on now to Millie.
Thanks so much, Lynn. I wonder if you can help me put up that presentation, the slide deck.
Absolutely. I'm going to share the screen right now. Can we see it?
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much. Welcome, and thanks everyone for being flexible and joining the session in the afternoon. I do apologize for the reschedule that needed to happen, but I'm very appreciative for Lynn for being able to accommodate a rescheduling as well. Today's topic is going to be performance management and some ELR fundamentals for nonprofits. So I'm really going to focus likely on non-unionized environments, but we'll definitely and can talk about what performance management looks like for unionized environments. We can go to the next slide, Lynn, please. Just a brief agenda of what I'm hoping to talk about today. So we'll define what performance management is. Then we'll talk about what performance management looks like through the employee life cycle. Performance management doesn't happen just at a period of time. It can happen at any time, and it actually starts from the moment that we hire someone to the point that when someone ends employment with an organization or retires. Then we'll talk about what supporting employee performance looks like, and we'll go through a bit of very high level tools that you can use for starting addressing performance management conversations with your staff. Then we'll talk about, and this is a carryover from our very first session that we had on staffing, where we're going to talk about, on pandemic. So we'll talk about, does performance management looks any different during the pandemic time? And then I built enough time to have a Q&A session. So if you have any specific questions that you want to ask, or things that we may not touch today that we can definitely spend some time talking about. Next slide, please, Lynn. Perfect. So what is performance management? So performance management is the process of creating a work environment or a setting, an environment in where people are enabled to perform to the best of their abilities. We call performance management a whole system, and it begins when an employee starts with an organization. It is an ongoing communication process. It's undertaken in a partnership level. It's definitely not a one-sided process. And it also involves establishing clear expectations and understanding about, so we'll talk about those what is employment. So it's looking at, the essential job functions of the employee expected to do and how their performance contributes to the overall goals of the organization. It is also aimed at developing the individual, right? Like, it's not always about discipline, it's always about developing individuals. And as such, it is very much personalized and individual driven. It is targeted and intentional. And what I mean targeted is, like, you have a goal in mind when you start working with an employee. It is about how an employee and a supervisor will work together to sustain, improve, or build an existing performance. It is also about those set clear measures. So how performance and how job will be measured in that particular position and job that the employee is performing. And it's also about identifying barriers. So what is preventing an employee from being able to successfully accomplish all the tasks of their job? So that gives us a starting point, and we'll continue to talk about what performance management looks like as we flesh things out through the presentation. One of the things that I want to talk about is what performance management is not, right? So I want to kind of outline and start to create some clarity about best practices around performance management. So performance management is not about doing a conversation once a year. As mentioned before, performance management is a process that continues. It starts from the point the employee starts with the organization till the time they leave. It is not done, it is not aimed at improving all skills. So I talked on the what ifs about being targeted and intentional. So the goal of performance management is not to completely change someone. It's about really helping them and support them into fulfilling successfully the duties of their job. So it was probably going to be targeted at very specific skills, abilities, competencies, and not everything that the employee is going to be doing in the organization. It is not a one-sided process. As I mentioned before, it's collaborative and it involves everyone. It is not about forcing unrealistic expectations onto others. So sometimes we tend to believe that this is what we expect others, but we need to ask ourselves, is our expectations are being realistic of what employees can and cannot do? Think of, like times where the work may change drastically, or you reduce your number of staff because in a pandemic situation, you may have a lot of people sick. It might be unrealistic to expect someone to carry on the jobs of 4 different people. Performance management is not used only in poor performance. So I talked about the employee life cycle. So we'll spend some time talking about it. It is also intended at developing and improving someone's performance, and is not about just filling out a form once a year or doing performance appraisals. So it is a mean also to prevent poor performance. And that means that manager and employee need to work together at identifying and figuring out a path forward. But it is important to know that performance management can do for someone very positively. Like I can think of, like videos and things that I've seen of people where, the feedback that an employee would have provided at the beginning of a career in regards to their ability to perform their jobs could have been a trigger for like doing it extremely well in their career moving forward. So it is it is a dynamic process. You need to remember that we're talking about people's careers, people's lives and futures. So even though there's a big negative connotation to performance management can lead to a much greater chance to someone succeeding in a job. Any questions about what performance management is? Okay, let's move to the next question. Slide, please, Lynn. Okay, this slide looks like it's a bit chopped, but the title of that is it's what the performance management process looks like through the employee life cycle. So as I mentioned earlier, performance management starts at the time that someone is hired and it ends at the time that someone leaves or retires. So under this lens, I will apply, performance management through each of those stages and kind of contextualize what performance management looks like when it gets off track through that process. I think there's a question around performance. Can you do performance management 4 times a year? Well, I would ask whether it is performance management or whether you're talking about a performance appraisal, because a performance appraisal is a tool that we can use to assess performance. But when we talk about performance management, we talk about an ongoing process. So do you meet regularly with your staff to have conversations about performance? Are you addressing circumstances and events as they occur? So that's really what we're talking about. So as a tool, can you do, well, I think it depends on organizations. I think I've worked in organizations that have performance appraisal where you would touch base 3 or 4 times a year. So I think it would really depend on how often you want to meet and what your system and your model looks like. So definitely possible, but I'm going to go back that performance appraisal is a tool to manage performance. It's not necessarily the be all and end all of performance management. It just provides you with a measurement, right? Like that's what performance appraisal does. As a supervisor or manager, your responsibility is to inform your staff of expectations their need to meet based on the role that they perform. You need to manage their performance, and you need to address unsatisfactory performance and also recognize when good performance is going. So remember, it's not all about providing negative feedback. It's about also recognition. So performance management as a process, it talks about, expectations are set and work is planned. You observe performance for employees. You ensure that the employee has the ability to perform the job that is developed and also improve on the performance delivery that we evaluate. So I talked before about evaluation and how good performance is rewarded or recognized. So, if you have your performance appraisal system, someone performs extremely well, then you also want to utilize that opportunity to recognize for the contributions that they have done to the organization, but also to the performance of the job of this duty, their duties. So this little cycle kind of has 2-way distribution. So what you see in the center, the recruit, onboard, develop, retain, offboard, it is what we call the employee life cycle. So it starts from the moment that someone joins the organization to the point that they're off board. And through that process, we apply the performance management. So what does it look like? It looks like during the recruit and onboard phase, we plan performance. During the remainder of the cycle, so monitor really happens at any time of the performance cycle process. The develop most often happens after someone has been able to meet their basic expectations of the role, and then the reward, which happens kind of like I've been able to fully meet the expectations of my job, or am I exceeding the expectations of my job and I'd be rewarded? So this shows that performance management is a continuum, and it starts from looking at what are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that someone needs to be successful in a role. One of the most important components about someone starting in the organization, it's about the orientation process, because it really sets the employee on the right path, right? Starting right from the get-go. So probation, it's kind of the next, and I'm going to talk a bit more about probation on the next slide, but it represents an on-the-job assessment. Remember, when we go through the hiring process, we are able to assess individuals' needs based on the resume and the interview process, and through that probationary period, we're really validating that employee has all those competencies that we had initially assessed through the staffing process. Some of the tools that managers will use there are like work and learning plans that you would do from the very beginning when someone joins your organization. And when things get off track, you either enter the performance management or performance improvement process, or you move through corrective discipline. So we'll talk a bit more about corrective discipline when we talk about different culpable versus non-culpable behaviors, when we try to understand performance concerns. It is very important for you that if you have HR supports within your organization, that you work with them through this process. But if you don't, then that you have, like the appropriate tools and supports that you need to appropriately support someone or performance manage an employee. We can go to the next slide, Lynn. Okay, so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about performance management. And as I mentioned before, and I can emphasize enough the importance that performance management starts from day one on the job, right? And it is critical that through that orientation process, we ensure that the employee has a clear understanding of what the job assignment looks like. So whether that is a copy of their job description or job expectations or whatever documentation that you may have to provide a clear understanding or description of an employee's responsibilities, as this would be the basis of all their performance through the time, right? Also, depending on how you evaluate performance in your organization, you may want to start looking at assessing those competency, skills, abilities through the probationary period. Orientation is a key step in the performance management process. And if you focus strongly on ensuring that they have what they need to do their job, they would likely be successful through it. Let's talk about a bit more of what orientation. So again, ensuring that you have clear expectations, that employees understand what are the values of your organization, how are they expected to behave, and what are those critical competencies they need to be able to perform the duties, the full scope of the duties of their job. When we talk about probation, I think probation depends on what your organization has, right? Some organizations may not have probationary periods. They may just hire someone who automatically becomes permanent at the point of being hired. But there might be others that have to fulfill a probationary period. So that probationary period represents that time when we, as I mentioned before, assess that those competencies we observe during the recruitment process are in fact in there. I think also that probationary reviews can be extremely helpful from a labor relations perspective, because it provides an opportunity for you as the hiring manager or the supervisor of this employee with an opportunity to understand any gaps or concerns in regards to someone's performance, as well as an opportunity to discuss how those gaps can be resolved and a plan put in place. So if you access a probationary period, you would expect that at the end of that probationary period, there would be no surprises for the employee. And that means that as soon as you start, if you start observing that things are not aligning well with the competency skills, or that the employee is having challenges with meeting those expectations, that you actually start addressing them right away. If you access a performance appraisal document or a performance appraisal system in your organization, you don't have to wait till the time of those conversations take place to start addressing performance. As soon as you observe those behaviors, I highly recommend that you start having conversations. So I think depend on the nature of the behaviors will depend the level of the conversation or action plan that you put in place, but we'll talk a bit more about that as we move through the presentation. So again, if you work for a unionized organization that has parameters around probationary periods, you may also consider that in situations where an employee's performance needs a longer time to be assessed, that you extend that probationary period if needed. But again, this is something that likely could be outlined through a collective agreement, but also could be a practice for an employer without a union. I think we can move to the next slide, please. So I'm moving through that cycle, through that employee life cycle, and I want to talk about what are some of the things that we want to look around performance during the develop, retain phases. So at this point, we're looking at observing behavior and understanding behaviors. So then we talk about things like diagnosing performance deficiencies, talking about like, where do we start, and then understanding culpable versus culpable. So through the life of an employee in an organization, when things go off track, you as a manager are going to have to spend some time figuring out what's going on. So your role as a supervisor is really to make sure that your employees know what is expected of them, and for you to make sure that you address any deficiencies that you may observe, right? Like, I think it's fair for the employee to know when things occur, that things haven't necessarily panned out the way that you expected them. So if you have expectations about how things need to occur, you need to communicate those very clearly. So the success of performance will depend as much for the employee than would be for you to set those clear expectations. So where do we start with performance? So, I would say looking at the behavior. What is the behavior being demonstrated, and is it in line with your expectation? Is it outside of what we would expect in a professional workplace for 2021? Is it what is driving the behavior? So understanding the why or the actions that you're observing or witnesses from this employee, and trying to figure it out again. Is this culpable and non-culpable? And I'll go into the definitions of culpable versus non-culpable as we go further. Consider the work being performed. So does the employee fulfill the competencies required for the job? And are the competencies required still reflective of the work that needs to be done? One of the things that I have learned through my career is that sometimes, and more often now than before, our expectations of someone's job change. Our world moves at an extremely fast pace. Our jobs may need to change drastically to address the needs of the clients that we serve or the mandate of our organizations. So sometimes we move so fast through that process that we forget to stop and think about, do I have different expectations given how the work has evolved? So asking yourself, like, do I still have realistic expectations? Are the expectations aligning with the work that the person does? So again, ensuring that you are on top of understanding that the job has not changed, because sometimes if the job changes and we have not communicated expectations clearly, it is very common to see gaps. And it's a double-sided process, and getting a sense of what employee is going on and being able to have an employee share their side of the story is very critical. One of the questions that we often get is, like, how do I know if an employee that reports to me is demonstrating concerning behaviors and things are slipping through everyday work if I am managing from distance? So I think this is one of those things where we can talk about the COVID scenario where you may not be able to witness physically or see or experience how those behaviors look like because you're in a different site or because you're working remotely. And I think there's a few things that I want to offer for addressing scenarios like this. If you have a team member that might be, let's say that this is more for someone working remotely, that you have someone that can, another manager or another lead of people that could share with you what they observe in the area, in the employee, that could share with you. But, use of technology to your advantage. So schedule regular meetings and use things like video conference so you can see physically your employees through a screen. Try to have more face-to-face conversations when you need versus emails or text or phone calls, and utilizing tools and resources that your organization may have that help employees work from home, if that is what your world continues to be. I think there's a couple questions here. Okay, there's a question about who performs the diagnosis of. That's a great question. And I intentionally did not talk about it because I don't know what your organizations look like. So if you have access to a human resources manager or human resources department in your organization, they would be a great resource for you to plan, perhaps validate and seek additional tools that can help you through the performance management process. Sometimes, depending if you work for a unionized or non-unionized organization, and depending what the dynamics are, sometimes the HR person might be part of fact-finding meetings or in potential investigations. They're there to observe, support, take notes, and that kind of support. But, I think overall, it is the manager, the immediate supervisor, or whatever authorities your organization has set out to be the person that is having conversations with employees. And I'm talking purely about performance management. I'm not talking about corrective discipline, as corrective discipline may look very different. So corrective discipline, I'm talking about, you've tried to coach, support, mentor someone through the performance management process. No changes were observed, and now you're at the point where you need to correct the behaviors through and with the support of discipline. So I hope that answers your question, Reva. Okay, I think we can move to the next slide. Okay, I wanted to spend some time talking about culpable versus culpable and just digging more on the employee and labor relations side of things. I think this concepts of culpable and not culpable really apply to organizations, whether they are unionized or not, because this is now going on the path of, I tried everything possible and I need to move to discipline. So let's talk about what's going on there. So what is culpable behavior? So culpable behavior is those behaviors for which an individual, an employee, is fully responsible and is deserving of corrective action, right? Corrective discipline. So the employee knows or could reasonably be expected to know what was required of them. The employee is also capable of carrying out what is expected, but they choose to perform in an appropriate manner. So an example of culpable behaviors would be a breach of a code of conduct that the employee is well aware of, that they may have signed a code of conduct for the organization. Another example of culpable behavior would be someone who knowingly submitted a false expense claim. So they were traveling and they were falsely submitting expense claims for expenses that they did not incur. The use of inappropriate language, I think it's another scenarios of culpable behavior, and failures to abide to safety rules. And I think this is one that as a public service organization, for many of you that work with vulnerable and vulnerable populations, that safety is a critical one. But if someone fails to abide to those safety rules, it's definitely looking on the culpable end. So when we look at culpable behaviors, we automatically talk about discipline, right? When we look into non-culpable behaviors, so those are behaviors for which an employee may not be fully responsible or deserving of blame. So for some of those scenarios, we recommend performance improvement. So we'll talk about performance improvement plans just briefly in the next slide. So in these instances of non-culpable behavior, the work performance always falls below the minimum standards due to factors that may have been or that are often beyond the control of the employee. In my experience, what I have seen is that typically two main causes that are behind non-culpable behavior. One of them is non-competence. So an employee that may lack the competencies to perform their job. So an employee try to endeavor to perform, but does not achieve the required performance for reasons as lack of ability or skill. An example that I can provide, if you have a clerk typist that cannot master the skills involved in word processing and the word revolves on data entry. I would link this to going back to that performance employee life cycle. This is something that could be mitigated through the staffing process with a proper identification of what the employee would bring in terms of competencies to the job. So just thinking kind of ahead, but an example of what an improvement plan would look for a situation like this is just trying to bring the skills of the employee up to speed in an effort to try to give them a chance to meet that competency of typing in the computer. The other scenario that I've seen where culpable behaviors comes into play is when an individual has a medical or a disability. So there are times when an employee cannot perform their job due to an existence of a medical condition. In these instances, generally the starting path would be to move through the disability management program if you have a program as such. But if not, in simple terms, that means, seeking medical information, getting to understand what are the restrictions that the employee has to determine whether there's accommodations that need to be put in place, or to determine if perhaps the employee needs to be placed in a completely different position. So generally, in situations where medical conditions or disabilities exist, we don't recommend discipline as a course of action to address this performance, because the employee is out of control. Like, it's not in control of, doesn't have the determination to say, I can snap my fingers and stop doing that, or I can snap my fingers and start doing that. So I want to pause here because I know there's often questions around culpable versus non-culpable behavior. So I just want to provide people with an opportunity to ask any questions they may have right now.
Veronica here. I don't know, Millie, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, sorry, I don't have camera today, so I will just speak. I have a question in terms of if it is like a medical condition that actually prohibits them to do something, that's kind of a core job responsibility, but the person is refusing to get the doctor's note, so we kind of can do that accommodation. How do you proceed here? How do you, like, what are the other options you can do before
Yes,
disciplining that person?
yes.
Thank you.
Those scenarios do happen sometime. I've actually been involved in situations where the employees are unwilling to collaborate. You know, I think the role of the employer in those circumstances is to provide clear information to the employee about what the path would look like. So the need of medical, it's really to do two things: to validate that those concerns are in fact, and when I mean concerns, those behaviors that we're seeing the gaps in terms of ability or competency to do the job are in fact supported by a medical reason. And number two, it's to understand what are the restrictions that an employee may have, because an employer, we want to make sure that we do not put this employee at risk by continually asking them to do that particular task that may be causing or exacerbating a medical situation. If an employee refuses, I think what I would suggest is just very clearly outlining to the employee what that means for you. It is very difficult for an employer to make any accommodations if we don't understand restrictions. So I may tell you that I need this, but my physician, who is the person trained to understand the nature of my medical concern, might be in a better place to tell me, actually, you think you can lift 40 pounds in boxes, but as a matter of fact, if you do, you're going to injure yourself, where you can only lift 5 pounds. So only a physician will be able to create restrictions for us. If an employee is unwilling to participate, and that unfortunately it's leaving you in a place where you may need to manage things through the performance management process, and potentially ending into discipline if behaviors do not improve. And we're thinking, if we know that there's a medical, but they don't want to provide medical information, that's probably when they would end up. If someone was to take an employer to, let's say, Human Rights Commission, claiming that they were not supported and they do have a medical condition, claiming they may have been discriminated for that, and we had no efforts to have an employee provide medical, I think, that responsibility will lay on the employee on not collaborating.
Got it.
Yeah,
That's a great answer. Thank you so much.
you're welcome. I see another hand up. I think it's Terry.
Hi, thank you, Millie. My question is, when I was in the workforce, the unionized workforce, the individual was senior, and every month he would take the allotted sick days as a me day. What would you do about that?
Oh, you were talking about attendance, which is one of those that I think are the hardest to have conversations. Like, I will go back to clarifying expectations. So if you have a unionized environment, there would be definitions as to what a sick day it's intended to be used for. And if you are aware of the employee taking that and they're not sick, I will remind them of what the expectation is that those days are for. However, it'll be one of those situations where, like, what facts would you have to validate other than what someone may have said, unless this is the employee that is openly saying that they're not sick, but they're taking time off. Perhaps it's reminding, is there access to other leaves, right? Like, perhaps it's referring them to a vacation day. Perhaps it's taking a personal day if that is available to the employee. But again, I will go back to restating what the expectation is for sick time, and remind the employee to take the appropriate entitlement based on their personal need, and go from there.
Thank you, Millie.
You're welcome. Are there any other questions? I don't see any other hands. And maybe we can move to the next slide, Lynn, please. Wonderful. So there's a multitude of tools that we can use for, I think there's a hand up now. There's a multitude of tools that we can use for managing performance in the workplace. Again, I'm going to focus on managing performance, not discipline. So I'm not really going to go deep into that unless there's some specific questions around discipline that I can certainly entertain and help you navigate your specific question. But I wanted to talk about like some of the 3 things that I have always find to be the most common tools that managers can use to start addressing performance. So when you have observed that there's behaviors that are worth looking into. So verbal counseling or coaching is one of those that I would always consider as a very first step. So this is the scenario where you as a supervisor will meet with your employee to kind of point out your observations. So you're basing on your observations. It could be, you're looking at records of work that they need to do, or you're physically observing them in the workplace and are concerned about how they respond to certain behaviors. And you have at this point determined that there are some patterns or that the behavior that is happening is not acceptable and you need to address, right? So at this point, some of the things that you would do through verbal coaching or verbal counseling is to actually indicate or advise the employee that the conduct or the behavior that you observe is unacceptable, right? And then you go around describing the impact that behavior or conduct or action has on their work performance or the workplace, because we're talking about it could be behaviors related to like misconduct, inappropriate communication. It could be, like other things like inappropriate language, or it could be inappropriate interactions with colleagues, right? So not necessarily on the knowledge, skills, abilities technically, but more on the personal side of dynamics within the workplace. You would then give the employee an opportunity to have an explanation for their behavior. So this is always critical, right? Remember that performance management is not one-sided. You always want to give the employee an opportunity to provide their point of view. So you will do that at the time. And then state the behavior required. So again, you go back to stating and reframing that expectation of the job, when you require that by, and what is necessary for them. So if the employee requires anything in order to be able to fulfill a particular duty, that then in that conversation, you'll find what that is and be able to provide that to them. For example, if I need to be completing typing 20 forms a day for medical claims, and I am only able to manage 5 a day because the internet in my office is really bad, then you as a manager will look at, okay, then we need to look into making the appropriate modifications in the workplace for the employee to be able to perform their job satisfactory and up to the expectation, right? After verbal counseling, and you've done your verbal counseling, the behavior continues and there's no change, then you can move to like formal counseling. So this is where you start to writing your performance and providing those directions to your employee in writing. So again, formal counseling often follows the verbal counseling. In this type of letters, you'll indicate very similar to the verbal, but in writing, the behavior that is unacceptable. You make reference to when verbal counseling or verbal coaching would have taken place. Then you'll talk about, again, describing the impact that their conduct had on their performance or in the organization or to others. Again, at this point, you're not necessarily asking the employee to provide in writing to you what explanation for the behavior is. Hopefully you would have obtained that before, but you would state that in your letter. you said that you were not able to perform this because of this reason, then you go back into stating what the expectation is and kind of summarizing the information in a way that the employee will be able to have an opportunity to get back to you. So you could do this in an email as well, like a formal written counseling does not necessarily have to be done in a
Right.
formal letter. Is there I think there's a question, or there might be a
Training.
question. Yes, I think it's Catherine. You have a question? No? Okay. It is also very, very important that through the performance management process, it does not matter what stage of that you document. So I have there document, because appropriate documentation would be key for you to go through this process and potentially move to discipline if needed be. The last tool that I wanted to talk about is performance improvement plans. So a performance improvement plan is a tool, and I think I briefly mentioned that when we were talking about non-culpable behaviors, right? So this is the scenarios where and the objective of a performance improvement plan is actually to help the employee achieve satisfactory work performance by providing them with the tools and resources that they need in order to address those gaps. So, while using a performance improvement plan, you need to recognize as a supervisor that the employees often, if we're talking about some of those critical non-culpable behaviors, that they may have a limited control over those factors. And so you might not be able to have a positive outcome out of a performance improvement plan. But when an employee genuinely says, I was not aware that those were my expectations, or I need to build capacity in learning how to type faster, or very specific things that I need to do about my job, that a performance improvement plan would likely help them build and improve their performance. The primary responsibility in the performance improvement plan is the employee. They are the ones that need to work through to improve their performance. Your role through a performance improvement plan is to make sure that you are clear on the expectations, that you're clear on the timelines. Generally, performance improvement plans have a timeline. So a clear expectation of how you're hoping to address the gap and by when you expect it, right? But ultimately, the responsibility lays with the employee. Your role as a supervisor would be to check in with regularity on progress. So, I don't know if anyone has used performance improvement plans, if they are familiar with what it looks like, but generally, performance improvement plan could go anywhere from like 30 days to, 6 months, depending on the skills that you're looking at. If a performance improvement plan is unsuccessful, you probably need to be moving then through the formal discipline, corrective discipline process. Any questions around these tools for managing performance? Anyone else wants to share some other tools that they may have used in the past that have helped with managing performance for their staff? Okay, no hands up. Let's move to the next slide. Lynn, please. Awesome. Okay, so I want us to spend some time through a discussion. And Lynn, were you able to share that Word document with the activity through the chat? I don't know if, I think you were going to share with everyone.
I'm going to do that right now.
Wonderful. Okay, I think there's a question. Hi, Amanda. Nice to see you. So you're curious about if performance improvement plan is unsuccessful, what ways could corrective discipline help resolve the issue? That's a great question, right? Like definitely, it is something that when we know that we've done everything, corrective discipline is the last resort for discipline. And it's really a way to kind of inform the employee that their concerns are, or the concerns that the employer has are critical. I think it would depend, right? And the flexibility of a non-unionized versus a unionized environment often have an impact on the use of corrective discipline, right? Like I think in unionized environments, before moving to a termination, you would likely have some corrective discipline on file. There's situations like during a probationary period when we sort of do a performance improvement with someone that may have some performance concerns during that probationary period, meaning we as employers have made every effort to support them into fulfilling their duties, and we can move to a termination on the basis that you were unable to fulfill and meet the expectations, even with all the efforts that the employer provided you to improve. I would say that the corrective discipline won't likely help resolve the issue. I think that would be the ultimate. I think it's more about process and ensuring that collective agreements or more demonstration of an employer doing what they need to do in order to let someone go. But I would say that corrective discipline is really not aimed at improving behavior. It's just at informing that the behaviors is absolutely not acceptable at that point in time. Perfect. Okay. Were you able to share the document then?
Yep, it should be in the chat there.
Perfect. Can everyone see the document in the chat? I can't see it. I don't know why. I can never seem to see it. Okay. Others can see it. That's all good. So I want us to have a little bit of activity. So in the document that I provided to you, we're going to talk about Janet. So it's a little scenario that I wanted to provide to you and spend some minutes as a group talking about some of the things that you can do to address performance. So I will briefly describe what the scenario would look like, and then Lynn will break for 10 minutes. So Janet is an employee that works as a claims analyst for the Ministry of Social Services. She has been an employee for 15 years. She's a single mom and has 2 school-aged children. Recently, a new supervisor started in the branch where Janet works, and this new supervisor started to notice some concerns with Janet's work. Some of the concerns that the supervisors noticed were things like Janet is supposed to start work at 8 in the morning, but she's rarely there before 8:20. So she's arriving late to work consistently. Her use of sick leave has gone pretty high, even though she has been informed that she needs to call her manager if she's going to be away. And call means a phone call and speak to their supervisor. Janet only sends emails out saying that she won't be in. In the last 3 months, 60% of the communication that Janet has sent out to her clients have had some sort of error. So for example, due dates have been wrong, the billing amounts are incorrect, or contact information as to how to reach her or reach others is incorrect. She's also made a significant amount of errors in the database where she enters the financial information on a regular basis, and these have been caught through the monthly audits that the branch does on this information. The last piece of behavior that Janet's supervisor has noticed is that clients have actually escalated inquiries because Janet doesn't get back to them on time. So over the last 3 months, lots of complaints have come to Janet's supervisor. So Janet's supervisor has actually spent some time with her and decided to meet with her and talk about these observations. So here are some of the things that Janet's supervisor discovered. So Janet recently had to switch daycares to a before and after school program. And this new program does not allow kids before 7:45. I would say that it's pretty likely that her previous childcare provider was able to take her kids much earlier than that time. Janet is also having a hard time meeting the requirement of calling the supervisor when she needs to. Also, Janet's sister, who was often a person that helped with her kids, moved to a different city. So Janet is having a hard time managing work and life and is feeling stressed. So the stress that she's experiencing is impacting her at work. And she's really having a hard time focusing and feeling overwhelmed in general. Janet also shared that she hasn't felt like she has anyone to talk to about what's going on in her life. And in regards to the response time that Janet has with the complaints that have been escalated, she says that she is not sure about her work priorities. She doesn't know where to start, and she feels that she's doing all of these with little success. So that is what we know of Janet. I wonder, Lynn, if we can pull the presentation back really quickly.
You want to, okay.
Just on one slide so people can see the questions that I'm hoping they can go through when they break out.
How about I put that in the chat?
You can, absolutely, you can do that in the chat as well. So when you break out in rooms, I want you to have conversations in your groups about 3 things. So what are some of the suggestions you may have for the supervisor in response to what Janet shared? So what would be your suggestions, and how would you take in her feedback that she provided to you? Are there any things that you might do to help create an open dialogue with her? And what other steps you may want to take to get a root cause of these problems that you have observed? So you've got the scenario and you know now the situation, and spend the next 10 minutes talking about these questions, and then we'll come back and have a conversation about your findings. Okay, I think we'll give people some time to come back. Okay. I think we have quite a bit of people back into the room. Good. Okay, so let's move into a discussion. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts as you walk through this question. So do we have any volunteers that want to talk about what they discuss in their groups? No volunteers. Okay, I'm going to say maybe someone from group 1 that want to talk about what they discussed.
Okay, I'll leave my camera off, and Jordan, you can jump in here too. But we talked about talking to Janet about adjusting their work time, and maybe they need to start at 8:30 and then adjust their lunch hour, or work later. Maybe that would be a good fair accommodation if that's possible for the workplace. And then asking Janet to be a little bit more proactive and make setting that expectation that they would come and communicate changes so that we could work out a plan before it turns into an issue. Suggest, I'm not sure how, but you would like maybe suggest some kind of counseling, because the personal issues kind of need to be sorted so that they have time to focus on these work issues, but I'm not sure how you could do that. And then we talked about possibly creating a buddy system with somebody that is pretty good at prioritizing their workload, and so that Janet could see that like from a super positive influence. And then about creating an open dialogue, we talked about having regularly scheduled one-on-one check-ins. And so maybe that starts off with a half an hour, like depending on how bad the issue is, maybe like every day or every couple of days, or maybe it's once a week, where you would start with like a scheduled 30-minute check-in, and maybe the first 15 minutes is to discuss the issue and expectations, and then the next 15 minutes is to discuss prioritization and improvements, and just having an open door policy and allowing for as much flexibility as possible. Those are what we discussed.
All amazing and great suggestions, Caitlin. So well done, Team One, for having a good discussion. You mentioned something, and you were kind of hesitant about, like, how do we talk to an employee about, maybe they need to talk to someone because their well-being, their mental health might not be 100%. If your organization has access to like employee family and assistance programs or any sort of supports related to mental health, you as a manager or supervisor are more than capable and have every right to encourage an employee to access and use them if they need it. Of course, at this point, we wouldn't be mandating someone to do it. There could be circumstances where you actually do that if you're concerned about someone's fitness for work. But in Janet's situation, if you're really concerned about her mental well-being, you could suggest, a reminder that we offer employee family assistance program and that there's someone that they can access to if they need help. So awesome. Thanks so much for your contributions. Rhonda, I think I have seen your hand up.
I was going to say what you just said, that we talked about making her aware that there was some kind of employee and family assistance plan that she could access, and or that there, even in, if that's not set up formally, that in the insurance that there's mental health supports that she can, so simply making her aware that she doesn't have to feel like there's no one she can talk to. We talked about lots of things. We talked about some of the systemic things that these issues point to. Things like, is there flexibility in the day? Why does she have to make a phone call to somebody to let them know that she's going to be late? Why is it a phone call instead of another kind of communication? That's a systems problem. Is there a systems issue around caseload, right? That if she's feeling like she's challenged with priorities, is there just too much on her plate, and there needs to be are the job expectations realistic? So we talked about really going through her job with her to help her sort through what are the priorities and what is too much, and probably setting some expectations around accuracy, because I think that was a performance issue that was evident there. We talked about lots of things. Annette or Titilayo or Veronica or Colleen, anything that you want to add in? There are lots of things we talked to. Like, oh, I know the other thing was that she's a really good person to have in that position because she's dealing with a lot of the things that the clients would also be dealing with. So if possible, you don't want to lose her, because I think that she's bringing a lot of empathy and understanding to what her clients would be dealing with.
Awesome. I really like how you guys brought that perspective of what the employer can do. Our systems and our processes really conducive to a bit more of work-life balance for the employee. So I think that's exactly what you want to do, right? Besides hearing the employee, just asking yourself, is there anything that we can do to better create a more positive workplace, right?
And flexible too for her.
Yes, absolutely. Flexibility, it's something that has become very, very popular these days. Are there any other groups that want to talk about if they have anything different that they want to share with the rest of the team?
In our group, we had the same exact stuff. So everybody touched base on what our group kind of discussed.
Okay. Anyone else? Any other groups that so I think we had 3 groups or 4 groups. Okay, I want to open the stage for any questions that you may want to ask about performance management. Anything that you were hoping to address, to understand, that we didn't go through, that we can spend some time talking about it? Rhonda.
I think my question would be more about the performance assessment. At the very beginning, you distinguished between performance management, which is more ongoing, and performance assessment, which is more periodic, whether it's annual or more frequent than that. That what are some of the things that you keep in mind for that? Do you have, I don't know, do you have forms or tools that you really like for that? Yeah, I'm interested more in that area.
Sure, absolutely. I think, the performance appraisal type of concept it's a tool that helps you measure. I would say it's more like the measuring of that, right? So generally organizations will rate people into like meeting expectations, exceeding expectations, or not meeting expectations, and the gamut that you can create between it. Some organizations assign like a point system. Some organizations assign a checkbox system. So it would really depend on what, if you're using anything, what that would look like. I think critical for a successful performance appraisal in the terms of measuring is like, are you having frequent and ongoing conversations with your staff? I think when we talk about performance should never be a surprise for the employee. I think if you choose to collect a year of information on someone's performance and not provide any of that feedback to the employee, it is really not doing them a favor, but it's also not doing you a favor as an employer, right? Because you could have had someone performing much better way sooner. So I think the critical part is whatever system you use, to consider other alternatives to ensuring that you have ongoing conversations. So some of the best practices around performance reviews or performance appraisal systems are the reliance on regular check-ins with the employees. So, many organizations have gone to maybe like a twice a year documented performance review or performance appraisal with, like several verbal check-ins through the year. So again, it's just make sure that you're having those ongoing conversations, that you also take the time to recognize for the positive contributions. I can't capitalize enough to people that performance management is not just about addressing gaps, it's also about celebrating successes. So that contributes to employee engagement and retention, promotion of employees, and the overall culture of your organization. So ensuring that you have time to celebrate the positives for employees, and also when you have incorporated like points that need to be addressed, when you see improvements, that you celebrate and note those improvements. So there's quite a bit of tools available online, Rhonda, if you wanted to look at. If you're looking for something in particular, I could share a couple of, but generally, they will talk about the competencies and how they're meeting those competencies based on the job that they perform, and what are their observations, what are their goals that they're setting for the year or their plan, and how you're evaluating and measuring those through the year, right? So I would say those are kind of the basic things to look at into a performance review or performance appraisal system.
Yeah, I think I'm looking for something that's the one we have right now is extremely long and complicated.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't mind something that's
I wouldn't suggest ours either. Ours is extremely long and complicated as well. Any other questions that people may have? We have about 7 minutes before we're done. don't see any other hands. But that gives us some time to actually go through the very last slide that I wanted to talk about from the previous first session around performance management in a pandemic. So Lynn, I wonder if you can pop that up really quickly. I just wanted to touch base on a couple of things that I think are worth noting in times of a pandemic and whether that looks different or not. So I had hoped to go through this at the very first session when we talked about pandemic and we didn't have enough time, but does performance management look different during a time of a pandemic? I would say it's slightly different. I think there's an increased need for us to define and redefine what performance looks like when people are working remotely, when they may not have the access to all the tools and supports they need during a time like an emergency like this, but also our outcomes. Like I think many organizations, many of us had to actually redefine the way that we work and as such, the way that we deliver services. So definitely, I think an increased need to look at those measurements, how we measure performance and how we measure outcomes of employees. Another thing that I have experienced during a time of pandemic is that there's an increased need to be fair, consistent, equitable, and ensure that we address biases through as they happen. I think when people are working remotely and in situations where it's completely outside of people's control, that we really need to be mindful and treat people consistently, fairly, and equitable, not equally, but equitably, and making sure that we address bias. And what I mean equitability is like we look at every person at each case and not trying to apply a one-fit-all type of approach, right? I think another of the things that I think has really helped managing in a pandemic is effective regular performance check-ins and conversations, and ensuring that that we track those goals into whatever they look like, into whatever redefined world. That the constant check-ins have really been really helpful for me and my team and the people that I work in managing performance, because it's all very different. It's almost 2 years that we've been living under this world of on and off during a pandemic. So there's still things to be learned at that time. I think another of the things that I have seen is instead of moving towards the negative side of performance, it just really focused on opportunities for improvement. So when there's a challenge, just focused on how can we improve that particular situation for our employees and for ourselves as well. And again, regular and ongoing conversations around the volume of work, the deliverables, and any learning opportunities. Like we have heard, we recently in an organization went through our culture and engagement survey, and we received a lot of information from employees about how learning opportunities look so different during a time of pandemic and how much they've missed opportunities to learn in a more formal way. So again, I think those are some of the things that we can look at differently in a lens of a time of a pandemic. I don't know if anyone has any other questions before we let everyone go for the day. I don't see any hands up. I don't see any comments in the chat. Okay, well, then I think we're probably gonna call it a day. So thank you so much, everyone. It's been a pleasure being able to deliver these conversations for this last 3 sessions. And thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks, Lynn, for the wonderful opportunity to share a bit of my experience.
We're very grateful that somebody with your depth of knowledge and experience, Millie, was willing to share some of that, those reflections to the broader community. So thanks you. I know you're really busy in your job and that this is something extra that you took on. So, and thank you, Colleen from Luther, for recommending you to me.
Thanks, Colleen. Bye, everyone. Awesome. I think we have some people that are probably stepped away from their desks.
Yeah, I'm just gonna. Remove them.
Okay.
Just so that I guess we can pause